Well, good evening, everyone. Very good to see so many of you at our Zoom lecture this evening. I'm very pleased to say that we have Professor Stephen Mulhall here this evening. He's a professor of philosophy at New College, Oxford, and is very well known. He's written a number of books, appears regularly on Radio 4 on the In Our Time programme with Melvyn Bragg. And he's going to be talking to us this evening about phenomenology.
Thank you very much, Don, and thanks to you and Andreas for inviting me to give a talk to your society. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in. It's good to see you, or at least to see your signs of muted, no video panels in the Zoom window. My brief was to talk about phenomenology, and that's what I'm going to do. But what I'm really going to start off from is a sense that I had the moment I started thinking about this topic, which is that it's actually rather harder to characterize the subject matter here than it might seem to be. And I'm going to begin the remarks I have, which I'm hoping will last around about 3/4 of an hour, by trying to explain why it is problematic. So on the face of it, it should be an easy enterprise. Phenomenology is a philosophical tradition that's rooted primarily in France and Germany. And it begins in the second half of the 19th century with a figure named Franz Brentano. And then it works its way through figures such as Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and then after the Second World War, figures like Merleau-Ponty, Emmanuel Levinas, and Jacques Derrida. And it's still very much a living tradition, although its roots remain in the French and German side of contemporary philosophy. It's still developing. There are still people who call themselves phenomenologists and engage in furious arguments with other phenomenologists about what phenomenology is. And quite often it intersects in various ways with other Franco-German traditions in philosophy, particularly in the 20th century, traditions like existentialism or deconstruction. And that rather complicates matters, because the historical story you might be able to tell about how the movement began with Brentano and then developed in various ways through the other authors I mentioned gets more and more complex as time goes by. And another difficulty that's involved in simply giving a narrative of its development is that it's not really recognized within Anglophone, Anglo-American philosophy of an analytic persuasion as a genuine philosophical tradition. There's a certain amount of difficulty involved in trying to make clear to people in analytic philosophical traditions that what's going on in phenomenology really is a legitimate version of philosophical thinking or philosophical investigation. There are many introductions, book-length introductions to phenomenology as a movement. I'm going to recommend just one to you this evening, and not solely because my name occurs very briefly in the early chapters of the book. It's one by Simon Glendinning, and it's called In the Name of Phenomenology. I think you might find it a very accessible introduction to this tradition, although it also raises a number of really interesting questions for those who are already familiar with at least some figures in the tradition. And I'm going to take my initial guidance this evening from some of the ideas that Simon uses to structure his book. And in particular, he draws a distinction between the doctrines of phenomenology and what you might call its general approach or outlook. And one of the points he makes very forcefully, I think, is that if you look at individual members of the phenomenological tradition, you will see that they advance very distinctive claims about certain kinds of philosophical topics or problems. So, for example, if you know anything at all about phenomenology, one of the things you might know is that phenomenologists have a doctrine of intentionality. And what that usually refers to is the idea that, according to phenomenology, conscious states, mental states, are all intentionally structured. They have a kind of directedness or an aboutness built into their nature. So if you have a thought, it always is a thought of a particular kind about a particular subject matter. If you are in a state of hatred, then there's something particular that you hate. If you're in a state of love, there's something you love. If you're in a state of desire, that desire is always directed at some particular object whose recovery might satisfy the desire, and so on. So the idea is that something about psychological states opens them out, takes them beyond their own limits, and introduces objects towards which they're directed. That idea, intentionality, was introduced by Brentano, although it plays a major role in another phenomenologist named Husserl, who preceded Heidegger. In fact, it's a doctrine that you can trace all the way back to medieval philosophy, to scholasticism. But very often when people think about phenomenology, they think about it as a tradition which endorses a doctrine like that. And it's true that you can take doctrines like that and tell a story about how those doctrines develop or evolve or mutate as the historical narrative of the tradition unfolds over time. So you can find in a later phenomenologist like Heidegger a much more radical version of that same idea of intentionality when he claims that the human mode of being is essentially being in the world. In other words, he expands the thought that consciousness is always about something or directed at something to the thought that human modes of being in general are always situated. They always involve inhabiting a particular kind of environment. So the world becomes the ultimate object of states of consciousness or states of mind. But the trouble with trying to tell a story which identifies the distinctive nature of phenomenology in terms of doctrines is that those doctrines are no sooner advanced by one phenomenologist than they're radically expanded or refined or developed or even radically criticized by another phenomenologist. So if I were to tell you that, it's intrinsic to the nature of phenomenology to place emphasis on the intentionality of the mental, that would really not be so much a claim about phenomenology, but a claim about the phenomenology of Brentano and Husserl. And that doctrine has been radically criticized by successor phenomenologists like Heidegger, Derrida, Sartre, and so on. So there's something unsatisfactory about focusing on doctrines, not just because of that kind of difficulty, but because that, in a certain sense, one of the ideas that unifies phenomenology is a kind of hostility to advancing doctrines. And that's what leads Simon Glendinning in the book I was mentioning earlier to the thought that the unity of this tradition resides not so much in everyone signing up to a particular doctrine or set of doctrines about some subject matter, but in a shared approach or outlook, a shared conception of what philosophy is and how it should be done. And what I want to do in the rest of the talk is say a bit more about what that shared outlook is and how it might be best understood, and also what it leads to in the way of a certain kind of method that phenomenologists tend to cleave to. So what is this outlook that unifies the tradition as opposed to some set of shared doctrines? Well, one way of thinking about it is that phenomenologists tend to exhibit a certain kind of hostility to, or a certain kind of questioning resistance to, modernity, the modern condition, by which they mean the post-Enlightenment state of Western European culture in general. And one of the elements that they take to be central to that modern culture is scientism. Right? Scientism doesn't refer to the deliverances of specific sciences. It refers to the idea that science and its method or methods offer the sole route to truth and understanding everywhere, in every aspect of human culture and human attempts to understand the world. And in particular, that the methods of science are appropriate to doing positive, valuable, genuine philosophical work or metaphysical work. Phenomenology is unified in the first instance by a kind of hostility to this kind of privileging of science. It's not that phenomenologists have any settled aversion to reading scientific reports and results or to make use of them in their thinking. That's absolutely fine. In fact, a phenomenologist like Merleau-Ponty is famous for rigorously employing the results of experimental psychology to enrich the kinds of remarks he wants to make about the nature of the mind. That's fine. The problem lies in a certain kind of philosophical appropriation of science, so that instead of being one amongst many ways in which human beings can achieve a genuine understanding of certain areas of life or reality, it becomes the paradigm for anything that can claim to be a genuine process of advancing knowledge and acquiring truth, and in particular to the idea that philosophy ought to be done in a manner that brings it as close as possible in its methods and its presuppositions to scientific investigations of various kinds. So because they think this scientism is central to modern Western European culture and to the way philosophy is developed in modern Western European culture, they think that philosophy needs to, as it were, recover from being led astray by these kinds of internalizations of scientism. And in that respect, all phenomenologists, each in their own way, really want to refound philosophy. They want to ensure that it begins again. It has to find a new mode of doing what it's traditionally done. And that means that the relation of the phenomenologists to the history of their own enterprise, including the history of phenomenology as a philosophical enterprise, is an undismissible problem for them. And by that I mean that the phenomenologists' relation to the history of philosophy occupies a middle ground between two more extreme positions. It would be possible for philosophers to feel entirely confident that the prevailing traditional orthodox ways of doing philosophy are still perfectly valid and we simply have to continue applying them. At the other extreme, you might find people who think that the prevailing conventions of philosophy are completely worthless and have to be entirely dismissed and have no particular interest in establishing any kind of continuity between philosophy in the present and the future and philosophy in the past. Now, both of these extreme positions are ways of not experiencing any kind of problem as apparent in the relationship between the present of philosophy and its past. In the first case, there's no problem because you're simply regarding yourself as a straightforward continuation of the enterprise as it's always been done. In the second case, you're happy with a complete discontinuity between you and the past. You have no interest in maintaining any relationship to it. You might call that postmodernism. But what the phenomenologist does is sit somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, they don't simply want philosophy to continue as it has been done in modernity. On the other hand, they do want philosophy to continue. It's just that the only way in which it can continue is by radically reconfiguring its prevailing conventions, by finding a new way of doing philosophy here and now that keeps faith with the basic spirit of the enterprise as it's developed in the past, but which requires a radically different approach to doing it if it's going to be done in a genuinely productive way. Yeah. So that's the core idea of the phenomenological outlook as I'm going to understand it in this talk. What I want to do next is explain how that hostility to modernity and to scientism finds expression in a very distinctive way in which the phenomenologist thinks about the relationship between appearance and reality. Now, if you have tried reading any phenomenological philosophy, or you've dipped into introductions to the tradition, you might have come across a whole range of slogans that are associated with phenomenology as a philosophical method. And I'm just going to read out a kind of short list of them, right? So one would be, there should be no theses in philosophy, no doctrines or dogmas. Another would be that philosophy should focus on description, not explanation. A third one would be that philosophy should examine the world as it presents itself to us without blinkers. And the final one I'm going to introduce to you is the one that I refer to in the title of this talk, that philosophy should go back to the things themselves. Now, all of those slogans are plainly different ways of trying to get at the same basic thought, but you might also think that they're rather trivial slogans. Take the final one that I mentioned, the idea that we should go back to the things themselves. What would the alternative be? It's very hard to imagine any philosopher saying that we should, as it were, go in the opposite direction to the things themselves. It's just a statement of the blindingly obvious. And in a certain way, that's exactly what the phenomenologists want these slogans to be. After all, they're not supposed to be advancing theses. They're not supposed to be making substantial, controversial claims. They take themselves to be reminding us of insights to which there's no real alternative. So things that might look trivial might be perfectly appropriate as ways of articulating what phenomenology is in the business of doing. But in fact, they're not really as trivial as they may appear to be. Yeah? That final slogan, back to the things themselves, serves a kind of negative purpose. It serves as a warning against helping yourself to unexamined preconceptions or theoretical posits, whether they're explicitly presented as such, or whether they've, as it were, been sedimented into our thinking about reality without our even being aware that they're a theoretical posit. Yeah. What the phenomenologists think in this respect is that when we do ask ourselves what our relationship to reality really amounts to and how it's possible for us to gain access to it, we offer descriptions of ourselves and of reality that have been more or less deeply shaped by a wide range of philosophical, scientific, religious, and ethical assumptions or preconceptions. And as time has passed, those assumptions and preconceptions have been, as it were, more and more deeply built into our thinking, to the point where we take them to be entirely obvious and beyond any question. And the phenomenologists want us to become aware again of what these preconceptions and assumptions are. Not because they think that we can ever attain a state in which there are no preconceptions or assumptions shaping our thinking. If we adopted an attempt on our part to entirely eliminate preconceptions, we'd be left with no orientation whatever for our thinking, no sense of what's significant or what isn't, what we might use legitimately to provide an answer to a question and what we can't use legitimately to do that, and so on. So there have to be some kinds of preconceptions shaping our basic sense of what we're doing and how best to do it. But what the phenomenologist objects to is the idea that those preconceptions are left unexamined, unquestioned, uninterrogated. What they want to do is, as it were, bring them to our consciousness and then leave us to ask ourselves whether they're really valid, really reliable, really genuinely productive or not. So one of the kind of reference points I want to use for the rest of the talk, which brings the connection with the distinction between appearance and reality more clearly into the frame, is Heidegger's own definition of what phenomenology is. It's something he presents in the opening chapters of his most famous book, Being and Time, Sein und Zeit, and it's an etymological definition. In other words, instead of thinking about doctrines or even about methods and outlooks, certainly without referring to previous figures in the history of phenomenology, even his own teacher, Husserl. Instead, he defines phenomenology by identifying the two main conceptual components of the word phenomenology. What he says is that phenomenology is the logos of phenomena. So let me just say a little bit about those two conceptual components. Logos is an incredibly rich, historically complex word in the history of Western European culture, from the Greeks right the way up to the present day. And it's a terribly difficult term to define. It can be explained or explicated in a variety of ways. You could translate logos as principle, as reason, as ground, as logic, or as structure. Phenomena, that's a term that Heidegger interprets as the way things present themselves to us, right? The appearance of things to human observers. So putting those two definitions of those individual conceptual components together, what you get from Heidegger's etymology is the idea that the phenomenologist is in the business of articulating the structure of things as they present themselves to us. Right. Now that definition, although it may sound very similar to it, is very different from what the term phenomenology means in the analytic philosophical tradition. When analytic philosophers in the Anglophone world talk about the phenomenology of things, they seem to mean something like the feeling tone of experiences, what it feels like to see or hear or experience such and such, or to be in a certain situation. Thomas Nagel famously wrote an article called "What is it like to be a bat?" That's not the sense of phenomenology that these phenomenologists have in mind, and it's not the sense of phenomenology that Heidegger is driving at. Let me give you a kind of concrete example to give you a sense of where the focus of the phenomenologist is going to be on Heidegger's definition of the term. Suppose someone is uncertain about the weather. They say, it looks like it's raining, but is it really? So we've already got an implicit use of the distinction between appearance and reality. Yeah. The phenomenologist would say, what is it for it to look as if it's raining? Yeah. In other words, their question would be, what are the conditions that have to be met for an appearance to be precisely an appearance of rain, as opposed to an appearance of something else? Yeah. And what they would propose to do is to, as it were, recollect as carefully, as mindfully as possible what we say when about appearances, to carefully describe our practices of identifying appearances as appearances of rain, as opposed to anything else. And they think that if they do engage in that careful descriptive act, unearthing and interrogating any presuppositions that they come across as they do so, then what they different contexts. And secondly, they will disclose the basis on which we do so. Yeah. Now, why would that enterprise constitute a valuable contribution to philosophy? Well, here we need to sort of zoom out a bit and recognize that you could argue that the distinction between appearance and reality is absolutely crucial to the foundation of philosophy. And that's because it's crucial to what philosophers have very long regarded as a kind of fundamental human drive, the drive to apprehend things as they really are. Yeah? Philosophers, on one level, want to acquire as much genuine knowledge about reality as they possibly can, but they're also constitutionally interested in how it's possible for us to get beyond the way things appear to us to be and actually establish the truth about the way things are. So they're very, very sensitive to the possibility that appearances might actually mislead us with respect to the nature of reality. This is why the Socrates myth about the cave is such a central part of the inheritance and the self-understanding of philosophy, because what that story about the cave represents is the desire not to be fooled by mere appearance, by the shadows that are projected onto the walls of the cave by the people who are manipulating the prisoners. What the philosopher wants to know is not just how those appearances are generated, but what reality outside the cave really looks like. Now, this sense that our ability to acquire truth and genuine knowledge about reality is fundamental to us, and that it's particularly important in carrying out that enterprise to recognize the difference between mere appearance, potentially deceiving or misleading, and the way things actually are. All of that is something central to philosophy that phenomenology is perfectly willing to accept. It doesn't question the importance of that basic drive. What it does want to do, though, is remind us that if and when we do apprehend reality, it has to present itself to us as such. It has to make itself manifest to us as reality in some particular way or other. And what the descriptive phenomenological enterprise is focused on doing is exploring the nature and the preconditions of that manifestation. Yeah. So although on the one hand appearances can mislead or deceive, on the other hand, when we do make contact with things as they really are must be able to present themselves in that way to us if we're going to grasp or comprehend them. And it's that aspect of appearance that the phenomenologist is interested in understanding more deeply. Yeah. Okay, just to summarize for a second, I'm suggesting that for phenomenology, the drive to question appearances really is central to our nature. It's perfectly legitimate, and it finds a certain kind of modern philosophical manifestation in the skeptic, the kind of figure that you see in Descartes' Meditations. And as that Cartesian skeptic might suggest to some of you, this drive to question appearances is prone to metastasize. It can become pathological rather than productive. It can get out of control. And what the phenomenological descriptive enterprise reveals is that we do in fact have a variety of perfectly ordinary ways of distinguishing how things seem from how they are, and so of correcting for misleading appearances, although of course we don't always succeed. And phenomenology devotes itself to mapping and describing those ways. So for example, when a scientist gets a set of results, he's well aware that those results might be misleading, and he has ways of checking to remove the kind of validity of hypotheses suggesting that the results are misleading. He has a way of checking and correcting his results. And this is true even in standard cases where the senses mislead us. If you put a straight stick in water, it will look bent. But we have ways of checking whether or not a stick that appears bent really is bent. One is just to pull it out of the water. So there are all kinds of different ways in which we are aware of and in which we can perfectly adequately manage the distinction between appearance and reality, correct ourselves and get ourselves closer to the way things really are with respect to any of these particular contexts. But in modern philosophy, incarnated in the figure of the skeptic that I just introduced, he asks us whether all of those ordinary practices are themselves mere seeming, mere appearance, something that takes us in completely the wrong direction, something that's essentially unrelated to how things really are. That whole apparatus that the phenomenologist is carefully charting and mapping, and that we ordinarily lead our lives within. In other words, the skeptic is raising a question that, to adapt a phrase from contemporary philosophy, has to be asked from sideways on. It's not a question that you can ask from inside these ordinary everyday practices of distinguishing appearance from reality and avoiding misleading appearance. It's a question which asks us to, as it were, abstract from all of that, step outside it, and look at it from a sideways perspective, or from what one might call a God's eye viewpoint. And this is a perspective or a point of view that, according to phenomenology, simply cannot be occupied. That's because the only kind of being who could occupy it would be God. Right? And what that amounts to, from the perspective of the phenomenologists, is that there isn't any such place to occupy. No such place for a finite, conditioned, rational animal. The very idea of there being a distinction between how things seem and how they are has been abstracted from any possible context for its meaningful use. The phenomenologist, after all, has identified a whole range of different contexts in which that distinction can apply and be used productively. But now we're supposed to leave all of those behind and regard any and every one of them as mere seeming, as leaving us essentially unconnected with the real. But precisely because we abstract from all those contexts, we're left with no possible context to use that distinction between appearance and reality. We've emptied the distinction of any genuine content. So although the phenomenologist might seem to be avoiding the skeptical challenge by just sort of bracketing it off and offering us a careful description of how we ordinarily go about our business, what they're trying to do is to get us to see that the perspective from which the skeptical question seems like a really gripping and fundamental one is just the illusion of a perspective. There's no possibility of us ever occupying that space, not because we're kind of limited in various ways that we might overcome, but because there's no such position to occupy. And once that's revealed as mere appearance, then the descriptive enterprise of the phenomenologist turns out to be a very good way of getting a better grip on how any meaningful distinction between appearance and reality can be managed and utilized to actually support the basic human enterprise of enhancing knowledge and truth. Okay, so that was the main business of the talk that I wanted to give you this evening, but I have got a little bit of time left. So what I'd like to do now is raise the question of what the limits of the phenomenological outlook or method might be, and how one particular phenomenologist has tried to handle one situation in which it looks as if the phenomenological method is meeting its limits or is running out with respect to its productivity. Just to give you an illustration of how a particular philosophical topic gets handled by someone who's very sensitive to both the power and the weaknesses of the phenomenological method. So what I've chosen is Heidegger's treatment of death. And this is going to take a little bit of introductory stage setting before we get to the heart of the matter. So it may take us a little beyond my 45-minute limit, but I hope that doesn't cause too much difficulty. Okay, so in the context of Being and Time, which was Heidegger's early philosophical masterpiece published in the mid-1920s, he's interested in doing a phenomenological account of the human mode of being. And the German term that he uses for this human mode of being is Dasein, or being there. And one of his central claims is that if you describe that human mode of being in sufficient detail, you'll see that it's temporally structured. As I already said a bit earlier in this talk, for Heidegger, Dasein's being is worldly. We always inhabit a world or an environment of some kind. And that world is primarily an arena for practical activity that's oriented towards the achievement of certain purposes or goals. Now, a whole variety of implications follows from that claim, but one of them is that each moment of Darsine's worldly existence is internally related to the future, to that which is not yet, but will be, if we carry out a particular course of practical activity. And he goes on to point out that underlying that openness to specific ends that we aim at and try to realize is a more general openness to ending as such. In other words, to the fact that our life runs out, that it has a terminus, to our death, or to human mortality. Now, in a very famous chapter of Being and Time, Heidegger makes the following claim about death. Death, he says, is our own most non-relational and not to be outstripped possibility. Now, let me try and unpack that terminology a little bit. What he means by the idea that death is not to be outstripped is simply that death is inevitable. Unlike most other existential possibilities, which we might or might not realize, we might or might not choose to aim at, everyone, sooner or later, is going to die. It's not to be outstripped. When he says that death is non-relational, he unpacks that idea himself by saying, no one can die our death for us. They can sacrifice ourselves to save us, but they can't die our death. And in this sense, death brings out something inherent in every moment of our existence, something that Heidegger calls the mindness of Dasein. And what he means by that is that every aspect of our existence is ours alone. It belongs to us. We own it. And in particular, that means that we have the possibility either of laying claim to that existence or to disowning it. And what he means by that is that we have a kind of responsibility for the form and the content that our life has, because it's in fundamental part a result of our choices, our decision to try and realize one existential possibility as opposed to another, to be an academic or to be a police officer, for example. But death is different because the possibility that is death is the possibility of the utter impossibility of our existence as such. And in that sense, death intensifies, radicalizes the mindness of Dasein's life. You might call it the undisownable epitome of the mindness of our lives. Now, that's already a fairly controversial description of what it means to be mortal, what it means to, as it were, to be open to our own end. But what interests Heidegger more at this point in his account is that it seems to create a problem for his phenomenological method. As we've already seen, phenomenology depends upon describing phenomena as they present themselves to us, as they manifest themselves in their nature. But that would entail that a phenomenology of death would be impossible, because our death can't present itself to us. And that's because when it's present, we're absent. Death, you might say, is not an event in life. Right? Dying is, but death isn't. And what that means is that death can't simply be a very distinctive kind of existential possibility, not even a unique one, because being dead is not a possible way of being. And yet, our mortality is a constitutive feature of our mode of being. Right? Being finite is part of what it means to be human. And one aspect of that finitude is the fact that we're mortal, that our life will come to an end. You know? But if all of that is true, then there couldn't be a full or complete phenomenology of Dasein, because a crucial aspect of the human mode of being would always remain beyond our grasp. Now, there are various ways in which commentators on Heidegger have tried to solve this particular problem. And what I'm going to do as a conclusion to this talk is to offer you my preferred solution. But it's by no means the only one. And many people would disagree with it. But I'm happy to talk about other possibilities if anyone's interested. So here's my preferred solution. Right? This is not really a problem for the phenomenological method, because what the phenomenologists can say, and what Heidegger, I believe, does say, is that the ungraspability of my death is its meaning for us. Ungraspability is precisely the mode in which it presents itself to me. What's so uncanny about our internal relation to our own complete non-existence is that we can't make sense of it. We can't grasp what it could conceivably be like to be in that condition. That's precisely why it disturbs us so much, why it's such a problem or a preoccupation. So an accurate phenomenology of death is one which acknowledges that it presents itself precisely as the ungraspable horizon or background of every moment of our existence. Because what it does is emphasize or underline or bring out the fact that each moment of our existence, each such moment, is internally related to its own nullity or negation. Because each such moment might not have been what it is. It might have taken some other form. It might not have been at all. After all, we might never have existed in the first place. And it might have no successor. It might be the very last moment of our existence. So the notion or the concept of nullity and negation is crucial in accurately describing the kind of finite existence, moment by moment, that human beings undergo and experience. In that sense, according to Heidegger's Phenomenology of Death, the concept of nullity or negation or nothingness is the ungraspable background against which all the graspable phenomena of life show up. And that means that phenomenology is in a position to make sense of death as ungraspable. Okay, I think I pretty much hit my 45-minute limit, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might have. Andreas, do you want to moderate the process?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. That was extremely interesting and an excellent summary of phenomenology. So much appreciated. I'm just going to put gallery through. We can now unmute ourselves, and I think it would be good for all of us to unmute and then give Stephen a round of applause for actually taking us through a very difficult subject. So well done. Thank you very much, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Very good. It's not quite the same as applause in a lecture theatre, so I apologise, Stephen, but I think this is quite good. We now come to the Q&A session, and we've got plenty of time, so I think we've got quite a few questions in the chat room already, which is interesting. But if you want to raise your hand now or unmute yourself and ask questions whilst we're in this format, please do so. Otherwise, I shall start reading out some of the questions in the chat room. Does anybody want to go first before we go to the chat room? Raise your hand, please, or indicate that you want to ask a question. Otherwise, I shall start reading things out. Nobody? Okay, well, let's get warmed up by the chat room then before we carry on. And I've got a question from Chris. What subjects or topics are phenomenologists researching and considering today?
Okay, so on the one hand, I think one of the most active areas of phenomenology nowadays lies on the boundary between phenomenology and experimental psychology. I mentioned briefly in the talk that Merleau-Ponty was someone who was particularly interested in what was revealed about our everyday modes of existence by experimental psychological studies of extreme or pathological mental states, because he thought that looking at abnormal modes of human being actually gave you a sort of reverse engineered insight into the normal structure or modes of human experience. And that's a tradition that's still a really active and central part of what phenomenology does in philosophy nowadays. There's a colleague of mine in Oxford named Dan Zahavi who does a great deal of work in this kind of area. And it's one of the ways in which the hostility to scientism in phenomenology doesn't at all equate with any kind of hostility to the results of empirical, experimental, psychological science. On the contrary, they think that's a potentially incredibly fruitful resource for the descriptive project of phenomenology. So that's one very active area. The other active area, perhaps this is unsurprising, is the engagement of phenomenology with its own history. What I suggested along the way in the talk was that it's not really a very productive enterprise to try and identify doctrines that unify all phenomenologists, because any given phenomenologist will be very likely to be radically criticizing what he or she takes to be the doctrines of their predecessors. And this is a kind of version of the basic structure of the phenomenologist's outlook that I was trying to lay out for you. Yeah, so on the one hand, the phenomenologist thinks that modern Western European culture is shot through with unacknowledged assumptions that are basically the residue of previous philosophical theories like Cartesian dualism. So because that kind of theorizing has become so central a part of Western culture, it affects what we take to be non-theoretical descriptions of the human condition. And the phenomenologist is deeply interested in revealing that what looks like a problem-free description, an uncontroversial account, is actually driven by these kinds of theoretical prejudice. But given that that kind of problem constantly emerges in other philosophical accounts and in the wider culture more generally, it would only be consistent for the phenomenologist to expect even earlier phenomenologists to have failed adequately to identify their own implicit theoretical posits or assumptions. And indeed, very often, that's the way in which the phenomenological tradition has, as it were, progressed, by a given phenomenologist turning round to one of their ancestors and saying, look, you presented that as a theory-free description, but in fact it is deeply, if unrecognizably, informed by theses. And I reject those theses, so we're going to have to start again. We're going to have to go back and do that descriptive job, but do it better. Get rid of the theses that the phenomenologist had unknowingly succumbed to.
Oh.
So what you find in the tradition.
Have we got tonic? Yeah, good.
What we find in the tradition of phenomenology as a tradition in philosophy is that phenomenologists make progress by criticizing phenomenology, right? So Heidegger radically criticized Husserl, and Sartre tried radically to criticize Heidegger, and then Merleau-Ponty did the same, and so on. So in a certain sense, phenomenology becomes just as much interested in its own history as it is in phenomena outside philosophy. But I think that's a perfectly natural development in a long-lived intellectual tradition. And I think it's actually entirely consistent with the spirit of the enterprise. So it's not just that phenomenologists want to refound philosophy, it's that they want to refound phenomenology every time a new figure comes along and starts the whole process again. Because the task of trying to avoid unquestioned presuppositions is just endless. And self-criticism is a crucial part of trying to get closer to that goal.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. And I think the link to psychology is obviously quite interesting as well, and the idea of stripping away any sort of base assumptions in terms of your thinking to get to the essence of things. So thank you for that. I've got another question here from Anna. Do phenomenologists recognize any other means of perceiving reality other than our five senses?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I think that it depends what you mean by the five senses, I suppose. So, I mean, I think in principle, as a matter of the phenomenological approach, I don't think they would want to exclude a priori any position on, as it were, the number of ways or faculties by which human beings try to grasp reality. If, for example, an empirical discovery was made that we don't in fact have five senses, but we have an additional way or set of ways by means of which we can acquire genuine knowledge about the world, then the phenomenologist ought in principle to be extremely interested in that. Yeah. But I think in this respect, at least, phenomenology tends to cleave to the basic scientific assumptions about how we acquire knowledge of reality. And what that would do is maybe add to the five senses our capacity for rationality. Yeah. I take it that most people wouldn't have any objection to the idea that beyond touch and sight and vision, it's also possible for us to derive knowledge by constructing arguments, drawing inferences, spotting entailments, and so on and so forth. All of that's also part of acquiring an understanding of reality. But in most phenomenological work, the idea that the five senses are a fundamental means of gaining access to reality is exactly the kind of claim that phenomenologists think is likely to be massively distorted by unexamined presuppositions. So this kind of story about knowledge as being ultimately based on the senses has led to various philosophical doctrines like empiricism, which claims that all forms of human knowledge have to be ultimately rooted in the deliverances of sense data. And that's the kind of philosophical theory that phenomenology earns its keep by deconstructing. Yeah. So it's one thing to think that our body is our primary mode of access to reality. It's another thing to offer a very detailed and specific claim about how those senses operate and what role they have in the general business of acquiring knowledge. That's the kind of thing where unexamined presuppositions and theses are likely to lurk. And of course, in the history of modern philosophy, this is a particularly controversial area. And in that respect, phenomenologists in general would be likely to be very suspicious about how this kind of claim that our grasp of reality is fundamentally mediated by our body, how that kind of claim is elaborated upon. Of course, it can be mistakenly elaborated upon in science as well, and in that respect, the phenomenologist would have an obligation to criticize it too. There's no kind of unearned source of authority in these kinds of debates for the phenomenologist. In the end, you have to test out the descriptions against your own best attempts to avoid unquestioned assumptions.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. The next question I thought we were going to get, because it's much more about the practicalities of phenomenology rather than the concept. So I've got a question here from Chris Taylor. It's a two-part question. Is there any time to use phenomenological methods and a time not to? Also, interested to know if you work with companies and businesses, are they open to phenomenological approaches? So can we analyze business and economies?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I've never been approached by a business to offer them my phenomenological wisdom. I'm not sure whether that's a problem with me or a problem with British businesses or whatever it might be, but that isn't something that I have any direct experience with, although I do actually know of at least one person who has wanted to write a phenomenological account of business, the modes in which human beings interact with a view to, let's say, gaining entrepreneurial goals. And that is something that could be genuinely interesting. I mean, in effect, take any pretty much any aspect of everyday ordinary human life, and you could do a phenomenology of it. Right? The question would be, what is it that's driving your interest in providing such an account? I suppose on one level it could be just a pragmatic one of trying to improve the processes. But it could also be philosophically driven. You know, you might have interests in the way in which economics plays a determining role in broader aspects of human culture that might be positively illuminated by that kind of work. So I certainly wouldn't want to exclude it in principle. You know, a phenomenologist can get interested in pretty much anything that a philosopher of any stripe can get interested in. And there's certainly a lot of philosophy of economics and philosophy of business life to get your teeth into as a phenomenologist. As for the first question you asked, this I could maybe do with a bit of further explanation. I mean, do you mean that, is there a time in philosophy when it's better to use phenomenological methods, and hence a time in philosophy when it's better not to? In other words, should I be thinking about this as the suggestion that phenomenology is just one approach and there are lots of other available ones and we should just choose between them according to the context?
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, Chris, do you want to clarify that yourself unmute yourself? I mean, I took it more to mean that, actually Chris has unmuted himself. Do you want to ask the question, Chris?
Yeah, actually it's a lady here. I was actually thinking exactly that, that Stephen described. So would you use it as a particular approach within philosophy, and when to use it? That's where I was coming from.
I think there would be something misleading about the idea that the phenomenological method or the phenomenological outlook is one option in a kind of toolbox of options that philosophers are free to use and then free to move on or dispense with altogether according to the context. And that, I think, is because of the rather general nature of phenomenology's criticism of philosophy and the modern history of philosophy. The trouble, I think, would reside in the image I just used to try and kind of picture your question. You know, the idea that philosophers have a toolbox and a set of equipmental resources to hand, that implies that philosophy is in the business of performing some kind of practical task or some range of practical tasks, as if we're problem solvers, as if we're, as it were, conceptual engineers or something of that kind. And I think phenomenology as a tradition would be deeply resistant to that way of thinking about the role or the status of philosophy in the broader culture. Not because the phenomenologist has any objection to, as it were, what you might call practical, pragmatic forms of activity, which are perfectly valuable in their place and constitute a very significant contribution to the business of understanding reality better, making our lives better, and so on. But the idea that philosophy is a kind of species of that genus, that would be really worrying, I think, for the phenomenologist, because particularly in the later stages of the tradition, philosophy is thought of as having originated in a fundamental desire to grasp what it is for things to exist at all. Right? And someone like Heidegger, who focuses primarily on a story about what it is to exist in a distinctively human mode, is simply engaging in a sort of preliminary version of that much more general enterprise. So the descriptive account that the phenomenologist is trying to provide is meant to be in the service of a kind of really fundamental, really wide-ranging attempt to acknowledge reality as such, as it presents itself to us, in every way in which it presents itself to us, and to achieve more insight than we currently have into what the conditions are that have to be in place in order for that to be possible. Now, that isn't really a kind of practical or pragmatic or problem-solving activity. It's much more a matter of trying at the most fundamental and general level to understand ourselves better and to understand reality better, but not in the kind of way that a science does, more in the kind of way that aims at enhanced understanding. We're not doing it for, as it were, any particular reason. We're doing it, not doing it to achieve a goal or a purpose of some kind. We're doing it because this is the way in which our drive to understand reaches its most kind of fundamental fulfillment. That's the best I can do, I think.
That's very expansive. Thank you, Stephen. And your comments of Heidegger and his exposition of death is raised quite a few questions. So there's one from Anna. But surely we can observe the death of other beings. And she follows up with saying, or can we only perceive, observe phenomena that concern us directly?
Yeah, that's a really important question to raise about the analysis of death. And I was skipping over an aspect of Heidegger's treatment of the topic, which explicitly tries to deal with this concern, just because I didn't feel I had enough time to go into it. But I'm happy to go into it now. So I think your suggestion is very intuitive. You know, if Heidegger comes up to you and says, look, how do you grasp phenomenologically what it means that your life will come to an end, what it means to die? And then I make the Wittgensteinian point I made, namely that death isn't an event in life. Well, it depends whose death it is you're thinking about, right? You can experience your own dying, but by definition, you can't experience or encounter your own death. On the other hand, it's a very familiar part of human experience to encounter the death of others, not just their dying, but their death. The death of others is an event in our lives. That's absolutely right. But the significance that Heidegger is trying to disclose here is not the significance of another's death to me, it's the significance of my death to me. Right? And this is why I introduced that idea of the mindness of death, right? What you lose in your way of experiencing the death of others is, as it were, the meaning of that death for them, right? That death has a meaning for you, understood as an event in your life. But that doesn't cast any useful light on the meaning of your death for you, because it doesn't cast any light on the meaning of that other person's death for them. So what goes missing if you do a phenomenology of the death of others is the mindness of your death, is the significance of the fact that the death you're trying to grasp is your death, not somebody else's. And that, I was trying to argue, is really fundamental to Heidegger's way of solving the problem that death kind of confronts us with, both as individual human beings, but also as phenomenologists, right? Because it turns out that death is a way of kind of focusing on the mindness of life, about the fact that life is always somebody's life, a life that somebody is leading, and more specifically, a life that somebody can take responsibility for or fail to take responsibility for. And the importance of the analysis of death for Heidegger is that it discloses that. It discloses something about what it's like to be alive, namely that you've got this incredibly intimate relation to your own existence that you don't have to the existence of any others who you might encounter in your life. And what does it mean for your life to be yours? To present itself as something that you can either own and take responsibility for, or disown or fail to take responsibility for. This is actually one point in which, if we had even more time, you could make a connection between Heidegger as a phenomenologist and Heidegger as an existentialist thinker. Because that idea that we're fundamentally responsible for how our life goes, and therefore we can be accused of failing to take responsibility for how our life goes, that is a very familiar theme in the tradition of existentialism. And it's one of the reasons why it's incredibly complicated to give you a nice, simple introductory definition of what phenomenology is.
I mean, I've got, in terms of the Heidegger and death, the sort of observational question I would have for you, Stephen, is that as far as I know Heidegger, his assumption is that we need to be able to face up to our own finitude in order to actually lead an authentic existence.
Yeah, absolutely. And what authentic means here is a mode of existence in which you take responsibility for what you do. Heidegger tries to get at the idea of authenticity by talking about what an inauthentic mode of existence looks like. It's a mode of existence that he calls das Man, and it kind of exhibits itself when people take up certain existential possibilities or choose to do one thing rather than another thing, but they do so in a way which suggests that they live out their choices as if they had no choice in the matter.
Yeah.
So, pandemic times notwithstanding, why did you go to see that film on Friday night? Because it's the new Hollywood blockbuster. Everybody's going.
Yeah.
Why did you read that novel? Because everybody reads the new Booker Prize winner. And the grammatical form in which those remarks are most naturally expressed is by saying something like, but that's just what one does, right? And if you formulate your relation to your own choices in that kind of way, it's as if you don't relate to them as choices at all. You're presenting them as if there was no choice exercised in the matter. And that's a paradigm case of what Heidegger thinks of as inauthentic existence.
Yeah.
Because you're doing certain things, you're making certain choices, you're living out your life in one way rather than another way, but you constantly relate to that life as if it isn't yours, as if it's a kind of impersonal mode of being to which you stand in an impersonal relationship. It's as if you're kind of haunting your own existence. And authenticity is the avoidance of that. Authenticity is a project in which you try to make your life your own.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's very interesting. I've got another Chris has got a question. And is there a key difference between Brentano and Hegel, given that Hegel wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit? Why is Hegel not the starting point of phenomenology?
Well, this is a good way of bringing out another reason why I didn't feel I could answer the question, what is phenomenology, by telling a historical story about it. It would be perfectly possible for someone to say that Brentano isn't really the origin of this intellectual tradition in philosophy, and by referring us back to Hegel. Not, I think, because he uses the word phenomenology as part of the title of that particular book, that very influential book, but because there is an analog, a very clear analogy between what Heidegger was trying to bring out when he talked about the logos of phenomena and what Hegel is trying to do in the Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel is looking for the underlying logic or rational structures of what might seem to be very rich and various and heterogeneous cultural phenomena. And in so doing, he thinks he's disclosing the essential nature of these phenomena. And in particular, he thinks he's disclosing that they stand in certain logical relationships to each other. Now, that is one way in which one could apply or adapt that Heideggerian definition of what phenomenology is. But the moment one starts going into the specific details of the Hegelian phenomenology, one finds oneself in a domain where Hegel seems to be making a very large number of substantial, controversial claims about the meaning of various aspects of human culture and the relationship between different forms of human culture and so on and so forth. In other words, from the point of view of anyone in the tradition whose picture I was painting, Hegel would look like someone who may aspire to a certain version of phenomenological method, but who more or less patently, particularly with the passage of time, is telling a story which is shaped by a variety of assumptions that he doesn't fully acknowledge and interrogate. Yeah. I mean, after all, when I told the story about Brentano as someone who introduced the idea of the intentionality of consciousness, I did mention that he got it from medieval philosophy. He got it from scholasticism. And in that sense, you know, you can trace various elements of the phenomenological tradition back a great deal further. But I wouldn't want to exclude the possibility that a good case could be made for Hegel. I just think that the moment you start moving from the structural analogy I just outlined to the finer details of that very long, fascinating book, I think it would exemplify the kind of problem that leads to phenomenology endlessly being refounded, because the predecessor turns out not to have succeeded in coming up with a thesis-free description. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then we've got Mike. Well, let's go back into the audience. Mike, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, if I may. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You're talking about phenomenology, and from that has grown perhaps existentialism, and you just mentioned the word. Some still to be phenomenologists are not existentialists, and others would consider themselves to be existentialist. Can you sort of just give some idea where the dividing line lies? Sorry.
Well, I can put my finger on a kind of junction point, a point where a phenomenological analysis discloses a structure to the nature of human being, which makes it very easy for existentialism to make contact with phenomenology. And that has to do with the way Heidegger defines the relationship between essence and existence in the case of human beings, in the case of Dasein. Heidegger claims that when we're trying to understand the natural world, a natural and perfectly legitimate pattern of explanation is to explain how things behave by identifying an underlying essence or nature that generates that behavior. Yeah. And that pattern of explanation basically says essence determines existence. You know, the reason an acorn turns into an oak tree, the reason its form of life takes that particular shape and goes on that particular trajectory, has to do with its genetic inheritance or its chemical composition. And science, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on, make use of that pattern of explanation very extensively. But in Heidegger's view, philosophy has incorporated a tendency to use the same mode of explanation with respect to human beings. And Heidegger thinks that's a fundamental phenomenological error. It's an unexamined thesis that has shaped a lot of philosophical thinking about what it is to be human. In his view, there's no such thing as the human essence, or to put it a slightly different way, what's essential to the human being is the capacity to realize its own existence and thereby to construct its essence. So Heidegger's account tells us that when it's crucial to being human that you find yourself constantly having to make choices about what to do next. This is the orientation to the future that I was talking about at the beginning of my remarks about death. Yeah. You know, you wake up in the morning, immediately you have to decide whether to stay in bed or to get up. Suppose you get up. Well, then you have to decide whether to go and have breakfast or to do something else. And every time you make one of these choices, you choose one existential possibility over another to realize. And every time you realize one existential possibility, you're immediately confronted with the need to make another one. So each moment of human existence is open to the future and requires you to project yourself upon one existential possibility or another. Now, when you have reasons for doing that, those reasons, as it were, explain the individual choices. So, for example, you know, when I talk to my students, I say, well, why do you get out of bed and then go to the library? Because that's what good students do. Right? And that brings out the fact that you're committing yourself to a particular kind of life, the life of a student, rather than the life of a police officer or a slob. Yeah. Why do you want to be a student? Because you think the life of the mind is more important than other kinds of life. Why do you commit yourself to a life of the mind? Because you have a broad vision what's most valuable in human life. And so what you find underneath all of these choices is a particular conception of what it is to be human, and you are, as it were, creating yourself in accordance with that conception by virtue of making these existential choices in one way rather than another through the course of your life. So it's not that there's some essential human nature that determines the choices you make. On the contrary, it works in the opposite direction. It's by virtue of committing yourself to a certain principled set of choices that you become a certain kind of person, a student, someone committed to the life of the mind, and so on and so forth. Now that picture of the relationship between essence and existence is one that Sartre inherits from Heidegger and radicalizes. And he basically says, you know, for the human being, existence precedes essence. Right? It's existing, it's making choices about how to exist that creates your essence. And that is the kind of core doctrine of existentialism. So it's in the way Sartre develops Heidegger that you find a sort of junction point between the tradition of phenomenology and the tradition of existentialism that can be traced back to people like Heidegger and to people like Kierkegaard, and further other cases in the more distant past. So that's how I would explain that particular intersection.
Thank you, Stephen. I like the idea of philosophy as a way.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Very good. David, you've got your arm up as well. You need to unmute yourself.
So, can you hear me now?
Yes, sure. Okay.
Yeah. So that's very interesting answer, Steve. Thank you. That was interesting answer because you seem to be like an infinite regress there in a sense. You keep asking your students about their choice and what underlies it, but then you get to this conception that the life of the mind is the best way of being human, or whatever it was. But isn't that? I mean, that you then have to question that, and where does that idea come from? And then don't you get an infinite regress?
Well, yes. I mean, the kind of existential choices I was talking about are exactly the kinds of things that can be done authentically or inauthentically. Yeah. So a lot of the students I meet haven't really made a choice to be a student. They've just done the next thing that one does after one's done one's A-levels, right? And that is a kind of paradigm case of inauthenticity for Heidegger, right? Because you have in fact made a choice. You've excluded other things you could have done at the age of 18, but you don't regard yourself as being accountable for it. You kind of think that you're just doing what one does when one is 18 after having had a certain kind of education. And that would be a way in which the governing kind of vision of what it is to be human is working on you, but it's working on you kind of beneath your conscious awareness and therefore beyond your range of responsibility. It's a kind of avoidance of responsibility, right? And, you know, another kind of very familiar phenomenon among students, particularly undergraduates in the last year of their degree work, is anxiety about their final exams. But the anxiety far exceeds the kind of nature of the challenge that they're facing. Because if it was all down to the difficulty of the exams, then you just have to revise better, right? But what people are really anxious about is the fact that once they do finals, the whole of the rest of their life stretches out before them. And they have the responsibility of deciding what to do with it, right? So this is the point where, you know, becoming a student because that's what one does kind of starts to run out as a strategy for leading your existence, right? And sooner or later, for most people, a point like that emerges, although it's not guaranteed. And it's not so much that there's an infinite regress that's the problem here. It's just being aware that this is what you're doing and this is why you're doing it. The moment you kind of dig out the fact that there are these more wide-ranging grounds for the particular concrete choices you're making, well, then you have a question, right? The question is, are you willing to continue endorsing that vision of what makes for a good human life, or have you changed your mind, right? And that's down to you, right? Nobody is going to be able to tell you what the right thing to do is there. They can offer you advice, they can tell you what they think about the meaning of life, but in the end, it's down to you either to keep on living in a way which constitutes you as a person who has this commitment, or to stop because you're no longer convinced by it. I mean, this is why this material fits quite neatly with that famous Sartrean story where after he gave a lecture, a student came up to him and said, should I stay with my aged mother or should I join the resistance? Right, this was in the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And Sartre said to him, not, stay with your mother or join the resistance, but why are you asking me? Right? And the point he was trying to make was, first of all, choosing Sartre for advice rather than the village priest was itself a significant choice for which the student needed to hold himself responsible, because you get different advice from those two sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, he was diagnosing the student as seeking to slough off responsibility for the choice. If I ask the wise philosopher what to do and he tells me, then I don't need to worry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the crucial question for existentialists is never the rightness or wrongness of the content of your choices, but whether or not you're taking responsibility for making them, or whether you're finding ever more ingenious ways of avoiding that responsibility. And that really is what Heidegger's talking about when he talks about the mindness of existence. Your life is your own, and we work very hard as human beings to hide that fact from ourselves, because if we don't, we're exposed.
So it seems to me that I've talked about an infinite regress, and you say it's not an infinite regress, but then it kind of seems to me that all choices ultimately don't have a ground. There's a kind of, not exactly randomness, but an ownness of it, as you put it. You just.
Well, it's not that they lack a ground, but they certainly lack the kind of ground that many people and certainly many philosophers think they ought to have.
Mm.
Right. So when you look at a particular ethical theorist like Kant, who's telling us that we ought to live our ethical lives in a certain way, if you ask him why should we accept your guidance, he will say something like, but look, it follows from the fact that human beings are a certain kind of creature. They're rational animals.
Mm-hmm.
So what he does is present his ethical advice as if it flows necessarily from a general truth about human nature, a particular conception of the human essence. And that is inauthentic, because that presents the relationship between essence and existence in precisely the wrong way. So if we, decide that we're going to live a life in accordance with the categorical imperative, and when somebody asks us why, we say, because Kant has told us this, right? We're in trouble, existentially speaking. And a philosophy that thinks that there's a right answer to ethics that's written into the nature of the universe is implicitly what phenomenologists like Heidegger would call an ontotheology, because the kind of paradigm case for this is the belief that God has created us for a certain purpose to fulfill a certain purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that we can't be religious existentialists, but what we shouldn't be doing is thinking that God has taken away our responsibility for choosing a life of faith. If you think that, the way to live is just written into the cosmos, that's a really effective way of avoiding personal responsibility for your life.
Well, there you go. So I think this is probably going to be the last. That was the last question. I think also Stephen gave such a full answer covering theology, Kant, Sartre. I think this is a good canter through quite a bit of existential philosophy in just one response. So We'll call it a day now because we're coming up to the sort of watershed at 9 o'clock. But could you please unmute yourself and give Stephen another big round of applause for what was an excellent exposition tonight?
Really clear. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Andreas and Don.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen.
Before you all go, I just want to tell you a little bit about the next upcoming lectures in the philosophy series. Next month, we've got Julian Baggini, who wrote recently a book, How the World Thinks. He's going to give a talk on pragmatism, culture, East and West. That's in March. In April, we have Professor Plomin giving a talk on parenting and the DNA revolution. And then in May, we're going to have a discussion group around a video by Daniel Dennett. So we're going to be watching a video by Daniel Dennett and then having a discussion around his philosophy afterwards. So that's March, April and May, and we'll keep you informed in terms of what happens thereafter. So once again, a big thank you to you, Stephen, for a very entertaining evening. And Don, thank you very much for doing the introductions. And I hope, as I always finish these evenings, please stay healthy, stay safe, and most importantly of all, stay sane. All the very best. Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you.